"Return the $50,000 or don't come back," Dad pointed at me and yelled. My sister added, "You took Mom's money." We all know. I placed the teller slips on the counter slowly. Their faces went pale. Nobody said anything for 4 full seconds. I counted them the way I count everything, automatically without meaning to. Then my mother made a sound I'd never heard her make before, somewhere between a cough and a word that didn't finish forming, and she gripped the edge of the sink so hard her knuckles went the color of the porcelain. 5,000, Dad repeated. Like the number was a foreign phrase he was trying to pronounce correctly. "Where's $5,000? "I don't know yet," I said. "That's the part nobody's explained to me. So there's more," my mother said, and her voice had a wobble in it I didn't like, a wobble that had nothing to do with anger. "There might be. I need to look at the actual bank records, not just the teller logs, before I say anything I can't take back." "You've already said plenty," Kayla snapped, arms crossed now too, the whole family apparently working off the same posture. "You walk in here with a folder like you're presenting evidence in a courtroom. This is Thanksgiving leftovers, Nora. This is family. You're the one who accused me of stealing from Mom over a turkey, Kayla. I didn't bring the folder to be dramatic. I brought it because you made me a suspect without checking, and it took me one night in a motel to find out you were wrong about who." Kayla's eyes went to Owen, just a flick, barely there, the kind of look you'd miss if you hadn't spent 9 years watching people's faces for the half second before they start lying. Owen didn't look back at her. He was staring at the photo of himself signing a withdrawal slip like he could will it into being a picture of someone else. "Bank error," he said finally. "Happens all the time. Deposit slips get miscounted. Teller's fat finger a 9 instead of a... It's not a typo, Owen. It's a 4th transaction. October 22nd, 2 days after the one you two already can't explain." I turned my phone back around and put it in my pocket before anyone could photograph the screen or delete the thread it lived in. "I'm not accusing either of you of anything else right now. I'm telling you what the bank's system logged. You can be angry at me for finding it, or you can help me figure out where it went before it becomes a bigger problem than it already is." "Bigger than accusing your own sister of forgery?" Kayla's voice cracked upward, indignant, but her hands were pressed flat against her thighs like she was holding herself in one piece. "I didn't accuse you of anything. The camera did." Dad sat down, just folded into the kitchen chair like his knees had made the decision without consulting him. He looked, for the first time since I'd walked in with the pie the day before, like an old man instead of a man giving orders. "Diane," he said it to my mother without turning around, "did you know about a 4th withdrawal?" My mother's mouth opened, closed. She looked at the calendar on the wall, the one with the church potluck circled in red marker, like the date might be written there too. "I don't remember signing anything in October," she said slowly. "I remember signing something, in the spring maybe, for the new debit card." Nobody moved. I felt the floor tilt slightly under a fact none of us had said out loud yet. "Mom," I said, gentler than I meant to. "What new debit card?" I'd been a forensic accountant for 9 years by then, first at a regional firm chasing corporate embezzlement, then at Larkspur Fraud and Risk Advisory, where my business card said Senior Forensic Accountant, CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner, license number I'd memorized the way other people memorize anniversaries. I'd testified in court 4 times. I'd sat across from men who cried and men who smiled the entire deposition, and I'd learned that the crying ones were more often innocent than the smiling ones. What I hadn't learned, apparently, was how to read my own family. I drove back to the motel that night, the Hillcrest Inn, room 114, the kind of place with a Bible in the drawer and a smoke detector missing its cover. And I laid everything out on the bedspread like a crime board, except it was my mother's checking account and my sister's face on a security still, and a number that didn't add up to anything I could make sense of. I called Theo at 9:40 p.m. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting it. "You're not supposed to be doing this over the phone with me," he said. "I already stuck my neck out pulling the withdrawal logs. I'm not asking you to pull anything else. I'm asking if there's a linked authorization on the account. A power of attorney, a joint signer, anything that would let someone add a device without triggering a fraud flag." There was a pause, keys clicking. "There's a document on file," Theo said. "Durable power of attorney. Dated September 29th. Name's an agent. Notarized." My stomach did the thing it does. That slow, cold drop, like an elevator cable slipping half an inch before the brake catches. "Whose name?" I said. "Owen Whitaker." I sat very still on the edge of a stranger's bed and looked at my own hands, waiting for them to start shaking. They didn't. Not yet. That came later, in the bathroom, when I turned on the tap so the sound would cover it. I told myself for about 6 hours that there had to be an explanation. That's the thing nobody tells you about finding out someone you love is capable of something ugly. You don't leap to the worst conclusion. You build yourself a ladder of better ones first, and you climb down them one at a time, and each rung breaks a little more of you on the way. Maybe Mom really had signed it, forgotten, the way she'd forgotten the debit card. Maybe it was for something legitimate, helping with a Medicare form. a car title. People sign things for their aging parents all the time and don't tell the rest of the family. Because families like ours don't share information, we ration it. I drove to my parents' house the next morning before Dad left for his shift at the hardware store, while my mother was still in her robe with her coffee going cold on the counter, and I asked her, alone, in the kitchen, if I could see the power of attorney. She didn't know it existed. Mom, I sat down across from her, the way I'd sit across from a witness whose story didn't hold together yet, except this was my mother, and there was no version of professional distance that survived that. Do you remember signing a document at the bank in September? With a notary? She frowned at her coffee. I went to the bank with Owen. He said it was for the fraud alerts. The text you get when your card's used somewhere weird. Her frown deepened. There was a woman there with a stamp. I remember the stamp because it was loud. It made a noise like a staple gun. Do you remember what you signed? Owen had it already filled out. He said, "Sign here, Mom. It's just the form for the alerts." She looked up at me, and something in her face had gone soft and uncertain in a way I recognized now. Retroactively, from a dozen small moments over the past year that I'd filed under, tired and getting older, and nothing to worry about. The time she'd called me by my aunt's name at Easter and laughed it off. The time she'd told the same story about the church potluck twice in one phone call, 4 minutes apart. The time I'd found her grocery list with the same 3 items written on it in 3 different sections of the page. I'd told myself it was nothing. I do that with numbers too. Round the small discrepancies away because chasing everyone would take forever. I just hadn't understood, until that morning in the kitchen, that I'd been doing it to my own mother. Mom, I said, I don't think that was a fraud alert form. Dad found out I'd gone back to the house, and he wasn't happy about it. Not because I'd upset my mother, he said, but because I was, in his words, stirring things up again right when everybody's trying to move past it. We stood in the driveway by my Accord, and he had his arms crossed the exact way he'd had them crossed over the turkey 2 days before, like it was a posture he trusted more than words. There's a power of attorney, I told him. Owen's the agent. It was signed at the bank in September, and Mom didn't understand what she was signing. Owen's been helping your mother with her finances for months. Somebody had to. You live 3 hours away. Dad, did you know about the HELOC? His jaw did something I'd never seen it do before. A small movement, sideways, like a man biting down on a word before it escaped. What HELOC? He said, too flat to be a real question. The one that shows up on the county recorder's site, filed October 4th against this house, for $120,000. I'd found it at 6:15 that morning before I'd even had coffee, cross-referencing property records the way I'd cross-reference a subpoenaed ledger. Your signature's on it, so is Mom's. I need to know if either of you remember signing it, or if it looks like this one too. He didn't answer. He looked at the house he and my mother had lived in for 31 years, the house with the pie tin I'd left on the counter still probably sitting there, and something in him seemed to fold the same way it had folded into the kitchen chair. Owen said it was to consolidate some of your mother's medical bills, he said quietly. He said it'd save us money on interest. Dad, nothing was consolidated. The draw went out the same week as the 3rd bank withdrawal. He didn't say anything else. He just walked back inside and shut the door. Not hard, not a slam, worse than a slam, a soft click, like he needed a minute alone with the size of what he'd just started to understand. Before I called anyone official, I did the thing I'm not proud of, the thing every fraud examiner is trained not to do and every daughter does anyway. I gave Owen one chance to fix it himself, quietly, before it became a case number instead of a family problem. I drove to his office at lunch and waited for him in the parking lot of Ridgeline Home Lending, in a strip mall between a nail salon and a Verizon store. And when he came out with a sandwich in one hand and his sunglasses already on, he saw my car and didn't even slow down. Not here, Nora. Then where? You've had 4 days to pick a place. He got in the passenger seat of my Accord instead, which surprised me, and shut the door harder than it needed shutting. Up close, in daylight, I could see something I'd missed at the house. A tightness around his eyes. A man who hadn't been sleeping either, just better at hiding it. The POA's a mess, I know that, he said before I could even start. I was going to redo it properly. I panicked when Mom's memory started slipping, and I didn't want Dad to have to deal with paperwork on top of everything, so I used a template. It's not a big deal. Notarization's a formality anyway. Owen, you used a dead notary stamp. That landed somewhere. His jaw worked. But what came out of his mouth next wasn't an apology. It was a threat wearing an apology's clothes. If you take this to the police, you're not protecting Mom. You're destroying this family for a technicality, and everyone's going to know it was you who did it. Dad already thinks you've got something to prove since you moved away. Don't hand him more reasons. I sat there a second, hands on the wheel of a car that wasn't moving, and felt something in me go very still and very clear. The way it does right before I sign off on a fraud report I know is going to end someone. I sat there a second, hands on the wheel of a car that wasn't moving, and felt something in me go very still and very clear. The way it does right before I sign off on a fraud report I know is going to end someone's career. That's not a defense. I said. That's a threat, and it's the first honest thing you've said to me in a week. He got out without another word. I gave him exactly that one chance, and he'd spent it trying to make silence sound like loyalty. I called Patricia Yoon from that same parking spot 20 minutes later. I called Patricia Yoon that afternoon. She was an elder law attorney I'd worked adjacent to twice before, on cases where an estate needed a forensic trace before probate. A sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd spent 21 years in a field most lawyers avoided because it was, as she put it once, all grief and paperwork, and half the time both parties think they're the victim. I laid it out for her over the phone, the withdrawals, the forged feeling power of attorney, the HELOC, my mother's confusion about all of it. Here's what worries me clinically, not legally, Patricia said. $120,000 against the house and $55,000 out of liquid accounts in under a month, executed by someone who had no prior authority, targeting a parent who may not have had capacity to knowingly consent. That's not sloppy family money borrowing. That's a pattern. People who are genuinely just helping don't need a fake notarization. You think it's fake. I think you need to find out today, not next week, because if there's an active line of credit, there's nothing stopping another draw. Has anyone locked the account? I hadn't. Nobody had told me I could. Call your mother's bank branch manager, not your compliance friend, someone with actual authority, and ask for an administrative freeze pending a fraud investigation. Then you call the police. Not Owen, not your father. The police. Today. And Nora, bring everything. Documents don't help anyone if they're sitting in your car. Detective Maria Delgado had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 14 years, the last 6 of them in the Financial Crimes Unit, and she had the particular calm of someone who had heard every version of "my family did this to me" and had stopped being surprised by any of them a long time ago. She met me at the station at 2:30 that afternoon, in a small gray room with a table bolted to the floor, and she went through my folder page by page without saying much, occasionally sliding a sticky flag onto something and writing a note in the margin of her legal pad. "You did half my job for me," she said eventually, tapping the stack of teller stills. "Chain of custody is going to matter here, so I need the original files from the bank, not your screenshots. I'll subpoena those directly, don't worry about it. This POA, though." She held it up. "This is the one I want to look at first." Why? Because if it's forged, it's not just theft anymore. It's forgery of a legal instrument used to exploit a vulnerable adult. That's a different, uglier charge, and it changes how fast we can move. She looked up at me. "Has your mother seen a doctor about memory issues? Anything documented?" "No," I admitted. Nobody ever brought it up. We're going to need that too, not to embarrass her, to protect her account, and frankly, to protect her from whoever did this doing it again while everyone's arguing about whose fault it is. She gave me a card with a case number already written on it in blue pen, case 2411487, before I'd even left the building. The notary stamp turned out to be the loudest thing in the whole case, in more ways than one. Detective Delgado ran the notary's commission number the next morning and called me back before noon, which I hadn't expected. I'd assumed institutional wheels moved slower than that, but fraud units, it turns out, move fast when the fraud is still live. "Commission number on that stamp belongs to a notary named Ruth Ann Castellano," she said. "Except Ruth Ann Castellano's commission expired 11 months ago. She retired. I called her myself an hour ago. She's never met your mother, never met your brother, and hasn't notarized a document since March of last year. So the stamp's fake. The stamp's real. It's her old one, the physical stamp, which she says she thought she'd thrown out. Somebody used an expired, discarded notary seal to make a forged POA look official. That's not a mistake. That takes planning." Delgado brought in a forensic document examiner named Daniel Cho a few days later, a quiet man who worked cases for 3 counties and had the kind of patience that made me feel, for once, like the slowest person in the room instead of the fastest. He compared my mother's signature on the POA against 4 verified samples: her voter registration, her old passport, a hospital consent form, a birthday card she'd written me the year before, under magnification, in a windowless room that smelled like toner. "There's tremor consistent with your mother's known signature in the loops of the D and the W," he said, pointing with the capped end of a pen instead of touching the page, "but the baseline pressure's wrong. Whoever guided this pen was pushing harder at the start of each letter than she does naturally, like they were tracing more than writing. It's not a perfect forgery. It's a rushed one." He looked up at me. Rushed usually means the person doing it knew they had a narrow window before someone noticed. I thought about the 4 days Owen had waited before agreeing to sit in my car in that parking lot. He hadn't been debating whether to come clean. He'd been debating whether I actually had enough to prove it, and Daniel Cho had just told me, calmly, in a room that smelled like toner, that I did. I thought about Owen's job. Mortgage broker, 6 years at Ridgeline Home Lending, the kind of work where you learn exactly which documents people never read closely before they sign, closing disclosures, riders, addenda buried in a 40-page stack. He would have known precisely how little scrutiny a notarized POA gets at a bank counter if the signature looks right and the stamp looks official. He hadn't stumbled into this. He'd built it. Adult Protective Services sent a caseworker named Grace Whitfield to do a welfare visit on my mother 2 days later. Standard, Patricia had explained, whenever a police report cites possible exploitation of an adult over 60. Grace was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with a folder of her own and a voice that stayed level no matter what my mother told her, which turned out to be a lot once she started. I wasn't in the room for most of it. I sat in the car outside because Grace had asked, gently, if she could speak to my mother alone first, and I understood why, even though every part of me wanted to be in there translating, defending, explaining. That was its own kind of lesson. My mother didn't need a translator. She needed someone to finally just ask her directly what she remembered. Grace came out 40 minutes later and sat in my passenger seat with the door open, one foot still on the pavement. She's more aware than you might think, Grace said. She knows something's wrong. She told me she's been feeling confused for about a year and hasn't told anyone because she didn't want to worry your father, and because, Grace paused, choosing the words, because your sister told her more than once that she was getting forgetful, and it was probably nothing, and she believed her. Something in my chest went hard and cold at that. Not the theft. This. Someone had noticed my mother's mind slipping and used it as camouflage instead of raising an alarm. I'm referring her for a full cognitive evaluation, Grace said. There's a geriatric neurologist I work with a lot, Dr. Renata Okafor, out of Millbrook General. I'd like to get your mother in this week if you can make that happen. I could. I made it happen in 2 days. Dr. Okafor's assessment took 90 minutes and ended with a diagnosis that was somehow both a relief and a gut punch at the same time. Mild cognitive impairment, not dementia. Not yet. Early enough that with support, my mother could still make her own decisions about most things, but vulnerable enough that a patient, confident person with a folder of pre-filled paperwork could walk her through signing away authority over her own money without her fully understanding what she was doing. She's not incompetent, Dr. Okafor told me, and I could hear how deliberately she chose that word, like she'd had to correct people on it before. She's someone whose judgment about complex, high-pressure financial decisions has softened, in a way that's common, and in a way predators, even ones who share your last name, know how to find and use. My mother, sitting beside me in the exam room, reached over and took my hand. Her grip was steady, steadier than mine. I want to press charges, she said. Both of them. I don't care whose mother I am to them. I'm still someone's mother, and I get a say in what happens to people who lie to my face. I hadn't expected that from her. Some quiet, defeated version of my mother, maybe. Someone who'd let the family smooth it over the way we always had. Instead, she sat up straighter in that paper gown than I'd seen her sit in months. The crisis came on a Thursday, 11 days after Thanksgiving, at 11:06 in the morning, when Theo called me from a number I didn't recognize and said, without saying hello first, there's a draw request on the HELOC, $118,000. It's flagged for release at 4 p.m. today unless someone stops it. 4 p.m.? 5 hours? Stops it how? An administrative freeze isn't enough anymore. That only holds the checking and savings accounts. The HELOC's a separate lien against the house. To actually kill the draw, the bank needs either both account holders in writing revoking it or a court order, and your dad's not answering his phone. I called Patricia Yoon from the hallway of my office, my voice too fast. My hands finally doing the thing they'd refused to do in the motel room, shaking. Badly, the phone rattling against my ear. I need an emergency order. Today. Ex parte petition, Patricia said, already typing. I could hear the keys. Millbrook County Probate Court closes intake for emergency filings at 2. That gives us under 3 hours to get the petition drafted, get your mother's medical documentation attached, get Detective Delgado's case number cross-referenced, and get in front of a judge. Can we make it? We're going to try. Get in your car. I drove to Patricia's office doing 60 and a 40. Hazards on. The whole documented case sliding across my passenger seat every time I took a turn too hard. Gone. That's what I kept thinking. If we didn't make it, $118,000, my parents' house essentially liquefied and gone, would be sitting in an account somewhere by 4 o'clock, and no forensic trail in the world moves faster than a wire transfer. We filed the petition at 1:41 p.m. 19 minutes to spare. Though it didn't feel like spare, it felt like nothing. It felt like standing at the edge of something with your heels already over the drop. 2:20. Patricia's paralegal ran the signed medical documentation across the building because the fax kept timing out. 2:41. The judge's clerk called to say she was reviewing it between 2 other emergency matters. 2:50. I stood in the courthouse reviewing it between 2 other emergency matters. 2:50. I stood in the courthouse hallway with my phone in both hands like it might shatter if I let go, watching the minute change on the display, doing the only math I had left. 9 minutes, then 6, then 2. The judge signed the temporary order at 2:55. Patricia called the bank's legal department directly, order in hand, and I sat in the hallway outside her office with my back against the wall, not crying, just breathing, counting my own breaths the way I'd counted the seconds of silence in that kitchen 11 days before. The draw was frozen at 3:20 p.m., 40 minutes before it would have released. Detective Delgado moved on the arrests the next morning, and she did it, I think, with a particular kind of satisfaction reserved for cases where the evidence had arrived pre-organized in a black folder. Owen was arrested at Ridgeline Home Lending at 9:15 a.m. in front of his co-workers on charges of forgery of a legal instrument and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. What Delgado found afterward, once his work computer was subpoenaed, made the original $55,000 look almost restrained. 3 other clients' escrow accounts with irregularities going back 2 years, small enough that no single one had triggered an audit, large enough together that Ridgeline's compliance department placed him on suspension within the hour, and the state's Division of Financial Institutions opened a licensing investigation the same week. He hadn't invented this scheme for our family. We were just the version of it he'd trusted enough, or underestimated enough, and to try at home. Kayla's mask came off differently, quietly at first, in an interview room, and then all at once. She told Delgado about a sports betting app, a debt to a man she wouldn't fully name, an apartment she was 2 months from losing. She hadn't planned the notary forgery. That was Owen's piece. But she'd known, she admitted, exactly what the withdrawals were for, and she'd taken her own cut of the $55,000 to cover what she owed. She cried through most of it, Delgado told me later, not performing it, just cried, the way people do when the story they've been telling themselves finally runs out of road. She called me that night. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to it twice. I never thought it would actually hurt her, Nora. I told myself it was a loan. I told myself we'd pay it back. And then I saved it because Delgado had asked me to save everything, and because some distant, still functioning accountant part of me understood that even an apology has to be filed as evidence now. Kayla pleaded guilty 4 months later to forgery in the 2nd degree and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a plea Patricia had negotiated down from the original charges in exchange for full cooperation and restitution, 3 years of probation, 120 hours of community service, and a payment schedule for her share of the $55,000 that would take her, by the math I couldn't help doing in my head, roughly 6 years to complete. Owen's case went further. Between the forged POA and what the state found in his work files, prosecutors stacked 5 felony counts, and 8 months after that Thanksgiving, he was sentenced to 2 years, with the possibility of parole after 14 months, and ordered to pay restitution to my parents and to 2 of Ridgeline's former clients, whose escrow shortfalls had finally been traced back to him. His mortgage broker's license was revoked permanently. The last thing Delgado told me about him, not that I'd asked, but she mentioned it anyway, the way you mention a case's loose thread tying itself off, was that his wife had filed for divorce 3 weeks after his sentencing. My father never faced charges. There was never any evidence he'd known what the HELOC money was really for, and Detective Delgado said as much to the judge in a supporting statement, but something in him had changed anyway, in a way charges couldn't have produced. He called me in February, the first time he'd called me first, in longer than I could remember, and he didn't lead with an apology. He led with a question. Did I miss it? He said, with your mother. Did I miss it because I didn't want to see it? I didn't have a clean answer for him. I still don't. I told him what Dr. Okafor had told me, that the people closest to a slow decline are often the last to name it, because naming it makes it real, and none of us want to be the one who makes something like that real. He was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line, and then he said, I should have believed you at the table. Before any of the proof. You shouldn't have needed the proof. That was as close to an apology as my father has ever come, about anything, in 34 years. I took it. My mother didn't ask me to become her power of attorney. I half expected her to, and I'd half decided I'd say yes if she did, even though every fraud case I'd ever worked told me exactly how badly that arrangement can go, even with good intentions, even inside a family that loves each other. She surprised me instead, sat me down at her kitchen table, the same table, on a Sunday in March, and told me she'd hired a professional fiduciary Patricia had recommended, someone with no last name in common with any of us, someone whose only job was to manage her accounts with quarterly reports Patricia would review. I don't want you to be my accountant, Nora, she said. I want you to be my daughter. I've had enough of people I love turning into paperwork. I understood that better than I could have explained to her. I'd spent 11 days that November learning my own family through exhibits and case numbers, and there's a particular grief in that, being the one who has to prove love with documentation, because the people who should have simply told you the truth didn't. Thanksgiving came around again. I baked the pie the night before, pumpkin, extra nutmeg, and drove the 3 hours with the tin belted into the passenger seat like it mattered, because it did. My mother met me at the door before I'd even gotten out of the car, steadier on her feet than she'd been in months, a hairstyle I recognized as new and asked her about, which made her smile in a way that had nothing guarded in it. My father took the pie from my hands at the doorway instead of waiting for me to set it down myself, and held it a second too long before he carried it inside, like he was making sure this time that nothing would get set down between us that he'd let curdle. Kayla wasn't there. She'd asked not to come, not yet, and I'd agreed it was probably right. Some bridges take longer to rebuild than a single dinner allows, and rushing it would only be another kind of lie. We talked on the phone sometimes now, careful, unfinished conversations that neither of us tried to wrap up too neatly. Owen's name didn't come up at the table at all. I sat across from my mother while she cut the pie into pieces too small, the way she always has, and I thought about the 4 seconds of silence in that kitchen almost a year earlier, the ones I'd counted without meaning to. I'd spent my whole career believing that the truth, once you found it, was the end of the story, the number that finally balanced, the ledger that finally closed. It isn't. It's just the place where the real work starts. But it's a better place to start from than a lie. My father knows that now. So do I. They'd told me not to come back until I returned the money. In the end, the money came back on its own, traced dollar by dollar through people who had no reason to protect me and every reason to be thorough. What I brought back myself was smaller than $55,000 and worth considerably more. I brought back the truth, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my family let me set it down at the table without flinching.